Do I call upon the right? Oh, that always scares me. Uh, Without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister here.
Test, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Your preference to chat, don't unmute yourself. Pronounce here. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think it's important for Arab-Israeli communities to be always vigilant and resistant over the political alliance that will not represent their rights and even abuse them in the future. As non-majority populations in Israel, it's important that we think supporting coalition of Bennett and Lapid is only them using us as a political tool to even prop up the regime and not giving us what we care about in terms of equal rights. So in terms of some model before we proceed to this debate, right? I think this debate is operating on the interests of Arab Israeli and what is the political aspiration that we aspire to have in the region amidst the increasing aggression to Palestine and also increasing aggression to overall Muslim population in Israel, right? So what we mean by actively opposing, it means that showing to the public, creating a public statement as in social media, in political arena, that as Arab Israeli communities, we are not going to support the coalition. It means telling the Arab Israeli communities at large that we communally should go together and should create a solid voting bloc that will campaign in support of Arab Israeli coalition party and not voting for this Lapid and Bennett coalition. We are going to criticize the policy made by Bennett and Lapid coalition in the political sphere, for example, in social media or in like community discourse. This means that as Arab Israeli community opinion leaders within the communities, we will influence our community member and our families and our friends that is within our scope of influence to actively oppose the regime of Lapid and Bennett and um, vote for the opposing party instead. So the alternative world that we prefer and what is the not the solution but like the action, like course of action that we prefer to have is that we will support the Arab Coalition Party instead in the upcoming election. We think that right now they are the third biggest faction in the country and it still holds a meaningful amount of number of supporters. And we think that this is exactly the very important support that they need. That's why we need to actively oppose in order to gain the voter for the Arab Israeli Coalition Party. All right, so going to my issues, right? I'm going to talk about how supporting coalition means being complicit on how this is going to even prop up the Bennett and Lapid regime, right? So I think one very important disclaimer is that we are talking about Israeli politics here. Note that the context slide said that Lapid is more centrist, but this debate cannot operate under the assumption that Lapid is going to adopt more centrist policies because he is still a very much right-wing by general standard, right? And the policies that he planned to roll is not anywhere near being centrist. So we are going to draw the parallel of this Lapid and Bennett coalition. It is going to be Netanyahu 2.0, which is not going to be friendly to Arab Israeli communities. This is proven by increased hostility by Lapid and Bennett in terms of policy making and diplomacy in international community on how they create increasing aggression to Palestine and increasing the overall negative sentiment to Arab Israeli as Muslims in the country. This is going to impact the social dynamic within internal Israeli politics on how Arab Israeli is being perceived by the rest of the community, right? On how they are going to be further discriminated and ostracized from the community, right? We think that this type of aggression is a political statement from Bennett and Lapid that you are not our priority right now, and we should actively oppose that type of stances. So we think that this type of political stances by the Bennett and Lapid coalition will not be much different from Netanyahu anyway, right? From the status quo that we hate so much as a society. We think that there is an inherent political incentive from Bennett and Lapid to not change their abusive and authoritative behavior toward Arab Islamic communities. Why? Because they want to maintain their electability and voting bloc to the majority, right? Since the majority has more number, it's unlikely for their political calculus to change anytime soon because they still want to prove why they are as an emerging leadership in the country will be able to maintain the stability in the internal Israeli politics that we all know is actually very volatile and very fluctuative. So I think they have a lot of things to prove here. That's why they will not risk it for Arab Israeli communities. That's why they will most likely just maintain the status quo that we have right now, especially when the policy between the majority versus Arab Israeli community is a trade-off. For example, on employment policies or on residential policies, on social issues that will directly impact Arab Israelis, not only in political sphere but also in socio-economic sphere, then they are not going to give equal rights to our communities. Right now, I think it's important to acknowledge that we are an important voting bloc because we consist of 1/4 of Israeli population, right? So as an alternative, we will instead vote for Arab-Israeli coalition that based on the poll is actually third leading in the country. So we think that by actively opposing it, it means also showing to the community that this alternative exists and we should not just succumb to the possible authoritative regime to our community, right? I think on the worst case scenario, even if they lose the election, at least more vote from the community mean more seats and more political bargaining power in the future in the parliament, right? Because we will then the leaders will understand that we hold certain chokehold of the political voting bloc in the country, right? So I think it means more variety of choices on how do we wiggle and in the political arena in the future, right? I think in the worst case scenario where the coalition party still lose anyway, I think it's the ballot that we are more than willing to accept, right? Because then we will be able to show the opposition block from the existing incumbent in the future, and we think that that benefit will still stand irrespective of whether or not we win the election or not. And also, secondly, we think that in terms of representing Arab Israeli interests, we as a community do not want to be used as a political tool to prop up possible authoritative government for our own community, right? I think there's certain duty to support Arab-Israeli coalition that is invented by our own community that has fight their political career for the sake of our interests as a community, communally, right? So we think that there are certain moral responsibility that we hold to actively oppose this possible regime where we're about to open this debate.
I thank you for that speech. To open opposition's case, I call upon leader of opposition. Here.
Okay. POIs, I'll take POI through unmuting or through chat. I think I'll check both, but I do prefer unmuting. And also, I really want to apologize to everyone for being late. I didn't realize that I muted my Zoom. Okay. Going to start in 3, 2, 1. Sure, OG. Maybe Arab Israelis is the third strongest party in Israel right now. But the third strongest party doesn't mean that you control like 25% of the people or you have a considerable amount against the first and second strongest. Because the third strongest party in US is probably the Green Party, which only holds 1% of the voices. But even if we assume that the Arab Israelis does have a certain percentage where it could matter, the first and second in coalition right now doesn't really make that a change. The first and second strongest political party in Israel right now will have majority over power and will have majority over the power of us Arab Israelis. And we, as opening opposition, think Arab Israelis simply don't want to go against them because of their very violent nature. And simply Arab Israelis' interest was never to be elected inside of Israel itself, because Arab Israelis now know that they are standing on very thin ice. Their main interest is survivability inside Israel itself. I'm going to explain to you why Arab Israelis is as much as in danger being ostracized from Israel. Okay, so first of all, what is our stance? Simple. We will not actively oppose the coalition. We will stick with the coalition. What is our mechanization? We are supporting the coalition between right wings and centrists and Arab Israelis in itself. This does not mean that we will just listen to anything the coalition wants, but this means we will still actively involve ourselves in the discussion and also policy making. But if the coalition is the overpower of Arab Israelis, we believe that it is fine to go with their policies that might not really focus on Arab Israelis, to go with their system that might not really focus to Arab Israelis, rather than opposing them, a very big power who is known for being violent, who is known to ostracize certain groups based on their race from Israel in itself. So what is the framing that needed in the debate? Arab Israelis' interest is to be able to exist in the post-conflict of Israel and Palestine issue. Arab Israelis only did coalition with Naftali Bennett because he was in the right wing and also the biggest party at that. He was the biggest power that existed in Israel. So they did this for the sake of not getting outcasted. They did this for the sake of survival. Arab Israeli, although not discriminated, is standing on very thin waters in where they are descendants of immigrants. What is happening in Israel right now? The issue started because Israelis believe that they are the promised people in the promised land, and how Palestinians actively oppose this. We can see that the coalition will not hold back to active opposers, and they will actively try to ostracize opposers, and they will actively try to kick out opposers of the coalition in itself. The status quo of Israel right now, the right-wing party and the centrist party is the first and second most strongest party in Israel right now, and their ruling is very big. They have very big influence in Israel. They have very big power in Israel, and they are very violent. Centrist parties are more open to discussion. This looks like how Yair Lapid has openly said that he is open to discussion with the US or open to discussion with international, unlike Naftali Bennett, who doesn't want this to discuss with everybody else. But before I get into my substantive, I'll take from CG.
The Jews are actually the immigrants to Israel before, before that Arabic individuals already reside in that area before Holocaust.
Sure, the Jews are probably the immigrants, but we must see that this status is not seen as so as by the Israelis in itself, because we need to play under the point of view of Arab, because you need to see that the person in most power is most likely unrational. So whatever the fact is, I do concede that the Jews are the immigrants, but the Israelis, but the right wing and the centrist party does not see it this way, because we can see that they are actively opposing the Palestinians. I'm not trying to offend anyone here. I'm just trying to say that the person with the highest power is most likely an unrational party who will most likely kick you out just because they have a fucked up mindset, and it is better to coalesce with this party for the sake of not getting kicked out. So what is my method? Why the Arab Israeli would want to do this? Although the right-wing party has Naftali Bennett, who is not a good person, most power and coalition in Israeli right now is handled by the coalition. This looks like almost all right-wing abide to the coalition with the centrists and also involving Arab Israelis. This means that actively opposing the coalition would put you in the target of coalition. So regarding of identity in itself, opposing the coalition is inherently a very unstrategic move, because you're fighting the biggest power in your country. Who does that? Who fight against the biggest power in their country when you know your biggest power is very violent? Second layer on this. This is very unstrategic because Arab Israelis necessarily do not have individual bargaining power compared to the centrist and right-wing parties inside Israel, besides with the coalition. This would put everyone under Arab Israeli party, Arab Israel political party under pressure, and also could be framed as the bad guy. Notice how the coalition framed Palestinians as pests, and the West gladly obliged and fought against the Palestinians as well, even though this is factually untrue. This is done because major country knows that whoever rules Israel after the conflict will have big monetary benefit from the oil trades. This looks like International is very happy to support the right-wing party and the centrist party in this, and wherever they say, they are happy to do this because they are the biggest in power. They don't really care about the facts. They don't really care about who are the immigrants. They just want power. This is what we need to focus on. Third layer, there was a reason on on why the Arab Israeli went to the coalition. Exactly because to be on the stronger side of history. We do concede that the coalition right now is very problematic in how it handles the Israeli-Palestine issue. But we have characterized that it is exclusively caused by Naftali Bennett and his fucked up mind of thinking. And most of the right-wing politicians in Israel right now, some of them has openly said to disagree with Naftali Bennett. Even Lapid said he is not fully supportive of Naftali Bennett's whole policy, but he is creating a coalition in order to be able to moderate this. So fourth thing, Arab Israeli, like in the context slide, is walking very thin ice in the eyes of the people most empowered. The people most empowered could easily frame Arab Israeli out from the coalition itself if they choose to oppose. What would happen if Arab Israelis actively oppose this? First of all, it creates unnecessary tension with the coalition. Arab Israeli right now do not really want tension because even Arab Israeli has a certain power of a certain percentage of power. They do not have overwhelming power against this first and second strongest one. So unnecessary tension against this is very dangerous. Second, it is very bad timing. Naftali Bennett is leaving next year, and US Arab Israelis will actively oppose the right wing now. Notice how easy they are going to frame you out of the whole condition, saying that, oh, you are supporting Naftali Bennett, oh, you are supporting the idea of very big violence, you are supporting the unnecessary and unrational policies of Naftali Bennett, and this is why Naftali Bennett left, and this is why you live with them. This will put Arab Israelis in very big target for very violent interventions coming from the centrist and from the right-wing party, because I've characterized to you that they do tend to do this. So although we do agree that yes, some of their policies might not cater specifically to Arab Israelis, it's better for us to live in this inconvenience rather than risking an all-out war, which we know they are very obliged to do an all-out war against people who actively oppose them. It is better to live with less money rather than in the situation of war against the biggest party in Israel right now. As Arab Israelis, I do think this is their interest.
I thank you for that speech. Then I'll call upon Deputy Prime Minister here.
Checking my audible.
Yes, you are.
All right. I'll start in a couple of seconds. What you heard in previous speech is a speech without analysis on policy, without analysis on political spectrum of Israeli politics. Jessica told you about the spectrum of Israeli politics, how even Yair Lapid, who is considerably centrist, is not. It's just like the current Republican versus the paleo Republican, for instance, the spectrum shifted to the right. What they are doing, opening opposition, is just becoming a cheerleader for the winning team and not advocating for the policy of your interests. That's what's mistakenly done by them. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things here. Number one, I'm going to talk about the policy that they suggest that supporting the winning team is better. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the alternative of supporting jointless at parties, the coalition between four parties, quite large, hold more than 10% in Knesset, like increasing from 13 to 15 seats in Knesset out of 122, 144, something like that. So firstly, it's incredibly weird for opening opposition to just say that because there's a winning coalition, we need to be a supporters of them without analyzing the policy that they support. Because Naftali Bennett, literally in his Twitter, I follow him, kept addressing and keep accusing Iran of breaching the nuclear deal, of having enrichment facilities, essentially increasing the tension in the region, advocating for wars and for more weaponry assistance from the United States. So this is bad. The first term of coalition is bad. The second term, Yair Lapid, is nowhere better for me because he literally said a couple of years ago that most of the blame within Israeli-Palestinian conflict is on the Palestinian side and they are not ready to make peace with us. That is literally his quote. So what this shows to you is even the centrist candidate in Israel is a right wing because the people have been too habituated with fear-mongering policy and fear-mongering rhetorics to the extent that the Arab Israeli keep getting the social exclusion, increased crime rate. They are the victims, they have the highest percentage of hate crime towards them in Israeli, no doubt about that. And even the nation state law still states that they're second-class citizens, ladies and gentlemen. What changes? So you're just supporters of the winning coalition who keeps policies against your interests. That's what you are literally doing. So when you're saying Well, the coalition won't hold back against the active opposers. They're opposing you right now without you, even in status quo, without you doing anything. So when you actively oppose them, you actually have hope. And at the very least, even if you're not winning, showing resistance to evil, which we think is good in itself. So that's very important. As if it's going to change anything in their side, as if the fear-mongering rhetorics, and as if you will be considered important enough if you join their coalition. Weird. So what is the alternative? The alternative is clear: a joinless party consisting of big party relatively such as Hadash and Tall party. And don't buy to their argument. This is just the third party, most likely like Green Party. Green Party holds less than 5%, I believe, of votes in America. I don't think that they're even considered established enough to be within the presidential debate. They're not even there. Ayman Odeh and Taibi, Massimo Taibi or something from Tal Party, are considered good enough of a leaders that they're heard in the Knesset, in the Parliament of Israel. And there is actually a growing momentum. So from around 2017 or 2018, prior to Bibi election, Netanyahu's election, towards 2020, when there were two failed elections, join-list party increased their seats from 13 to 15. So this is important, that there is a growing momentum and growing empathy, at least in Israel, at least from the more liberal society, maybe from the Alliance Party, or sorry, the Israel Resistance Party, that we can cooperate with. So there is, at the very least, or Kadima. So there is growing momentum in that regard. The political aspect also in this regard is that, just like what opening opposition said, the coalition between Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid is a purely pragmatic coalition, just for holding on into power. What we meant by that was that this coalition came after two failed elections to choose the replacement for Netanyahu, with no result, with no prime minister elected. So this is a coalition of coalition, which previously failed, ladies and gentlemen. So the purely pragmatic coalition like this will not change any policies, especially for the Arab Israeli Party. Most likely what happens is Naftali Bennett will just keep aggravating the tension with Iran, and Yair Lapid will just increase domestic hostility between the Arab population and the Israeli Jewish population, ladies and gentlemen. Let's take a look at the development of housing in West Bank, which also excludes pretty much the Arab Israeli Party from getting residential places. So that is the kind of fact in political climate that we have to understand. Before I proceed, any points from closing? I encourage an engagement. Closing. 1, 2, 3, opening. Is there one? 1, 2, 3. Fantastic. There is no doubt about that. Okay, so the corollary of what I've just stated, ladies and gentlemen, is Arab Israeli Party have two alternatives here. One, remaining silent or being supportive of a winning party, a coalition party that doesn't support anything that they want to have, even if the nation law enshrines that they're the second-class citizens. The only coalition that tries to change that is the joinless Arab Party. Ayman Odeh, who has been consistent in his messaging, the Hadash Party, the coalition between joinless party and also the Labour Party in 2020 election, showed to you that there is, at the very least, some factions within the country who have some interest in getting into coalition as well with the Arab joinless parties. These four parties becoming the third largest factions is huge enough already, to the extent that we can support it as a very probable alternative in comparison to them. This is the second alternative that we should desire. It's weird to say, for instance, ladies and gentlemen, that if you are a supporters of Green Party and pro-green energy, for instance, that because Republican won in 2020, therefore you needed to support Trump, right? Like, just because they're winning and just because you support them doesn't mean that they're advocating for your policies. So those are the kind of policies that we support. This is the kind of coalition that we need. For that reason, we propose.
I thank you for that speech. I call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. My pure preference is through the chat, but I will offer it anyway if I have some extra time. Wait. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in three. Wait. Mhm, mhm. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. What we want here, what we are advocating for, is that we want to let the Arab Israelis to be able to voice out their interests in the coalitions without having to be involved in an unnecessary conflict that could be avoided if you just wait for Naftali Bennett to go down. Like we know that, oh, okay, let's see that maybe Yair Lapid is still a right-wing politician, but we believe that Yair Lapid is not going to be as bad as Naftali Bennett. And even if at the end of the day, Yair Lapid is going to make decisions that are going to harm us Arab Israeli, are going to be very controversial as Naftali Bennett. It's still going to be better at the end of the day if we stick to the coalition. Why? Because we believe that if Yair Lapid decides to be Naftali Bennett in the future, then it's going to put us in a more dangerous way in a more dangerous position if we decide to actively oppose to that kind of power, right? And then they keep mentioning about that, oh, if you stick to the coalition, you're just cheerleading for for what they've been doing uh, uh, for what they have been doing this past years, right? But we're not trying to just keep silent about what they've been doing in the party. We believe that there's going to be a change that's going to happen if when Yair Lapid gets in position. Why? Because like they said that, oh, we're the third biggest political party. We're going to have enough power to go against them, etc., etc. If they admit that we have enough impact and we have enough power to go against them, then why do they not see, why do they believe that we won't have any power in the coalition party? Because if we already have enough power to go against them, then why can't we do it in a more diplomatic way without having to be without having to create tension and conflict in the coalition party? What will happen if we try to actively oppose this is that we're going to actually, first of all, we're going to lose our credibility with the centrist and right wing, that we could have do it in moderate way. And then if you try to like this, if you try to do coalition with other parties that are against right wing, first of all, they will see that we in the past we had ties with those right wings, that and they will be reluctant to actually do this kind of coalition with us. And second of all, even if they do want to do this kind of coalition with us, it's still not enough for us to go against them. It's still going to make it's still going to be it's still going to have we're still going to have this kind of conflict. They keep saying that, oh, by doing this, we're not going to change. Sticking with the coalition is not going to change anything. But we believe that the change is not it's not going to be very fast, and it's not going to be very instant. But instead of the change that you're showing, is that the change in your side, yes, it's going to be instant. What kind of change that happens in your side is that the numbers of how many people will lose their homes, how many people will get hurt, how many people will lose their lives just because you want to be to go to keep your high moral and your pride, that you want to go all out, that you want to actively oppose for this kind of coalition, right? We as the Arab Israelis have been tiptoeing around in Israel, because we believe that we don't really have that much power, and we need to be very strategic in in our in our way, so that we can have this kind of peaceful so that we can live in that place in a peaceful manner, and eventually help a better change with the power that we currently have. And we what's and we believe that there's nothing wrong with being hopeful that for the future that can happen without without the unnecessary conflict that you want, that you try to propose, right? The wait. And we think that it's very important to note that the all not all of the right-wing parties and the centrists are going to be very violent and ignorant about the Arab Israel's interests. There are some there have been increasing numbers of right-wing politicians and the centrist politicians that want to listen to those Arab Israelis in the coalition. Why? Because they see that those Arab Israelis are also big in number after those two other parties. They believe that if they can gain their favor, they can still hold the electability. They can have this more favor instead of just ignoring those Arab Israelis, because we believe that those right wings and centers are also going to consider that are also going to consider the power that the Arab Israelis are going to have if they actively oppose, right? Because none of them actually want to have to go an all-out war, because like we believe that Israelis and those in right wing and centrist parties are not really are as concerned as the Arab Israelis to avoid conflict. But the problem is those people have power to actually obliterate us if there is conflict if there is conflict that happens in the future. Whereas the Arab Israelis are going to be the one that's going to have this huge loss in the situation that this kind of conflict happens. And that's what we're advocating. We're not advocating for the trampling on Arab Israelis, but we believe that there is a more peaceful way towards this kind of solution, and that is what we are very proud to oppose.
I thank you for that speech. To open up the closing half, a call by member of government. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. PRI through chat, taking one from opening for engagement. If I don't respond until minute 5, unmute yourself. It's fine. Okay. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Progress is not slow in opposition, it is non-existent, right? What you essentially will get from closing government is the likelihood analysis of why this constant opposition is likely to be successful, fulfilling the missing analysis from OG shocklisted benefit. So 2 contributions from closing government. One, I'm going to talk about the justification, why this is a very important consideration as an Arab Israeli individually, something that has never been discussed in the opening debate. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the likelihood analysis, 3 points that you are going to get why being an opposition might work in order to advocate for progress. And all the responses to opening opposition will be delightfully integrated in the contributions. First, let's talk about justification. This is a very, very important consideration. 2 points of justification or like moral consideration whatsoever, why this is the correct thing regardless of the end result. One, we think this is a legitimate form of self-defense against an authoritative government, right? I think this perfectly lays down our response to all claim of, oh, who actually goes against a powerful regime Guess what? Social movement does, minority party does. They do that regardless of whether or not they will win. But they do that anyway because that's what they were made to do to begin with. When the reason why Arab Israeli parties exist to begin with are because Arab Israelis who are rising in population in Israel, by the way, is trying to consolidate power to go against this government who have been constantly oppressive towards them from like in the very first place, right? So as a method of self-defense against an authoritative government who will otherwise shut us down or ostracize us, whatever, like what opening opposition trying to tell you, more justification in our side of the house to go against them, right? But secondly, it's also important to consider the importance of my BOI earlier. I said the Jews were the immigrant. And this is a very important consideration because Arab Israelis know this fact by heart. And seeing that the Jews who entered your nation powerfully by Western intervention sit up in power and you don't do anything about that, right? This was like legitimizing colonialism and you willingly succumb to your colonial. In opposition, it's even worse because you empowered the regime by giving your political capital to empower or support the, strength of the particular coalition to begin with, right? So this is very important because how does this argument weigh in the debate? Two ways. A, regardless of the end result, this principle stands. B, this directly relates to the dilemma that Arab Israelis face on a daily basis, right? This is when they watch TV, for example, they see Jew figures speaking for their behalf. They see, like Naftali Bennett or even Yair Lapid, for example, who are still pretty right wing, talking about their interests as if they know everything about them, only for tokenistic change that is not likely to happen anyway in opposition side of the house, right? So this goes in their individual consideration, and they have to feel this dilemma every single day. In principle, that is already something wrong. We don't want to stand for that. Secondly, and probably the biggest contribution to government, let's talk about 3 points of likelihood why being in opposition might work. The only thing you heard from OG was that, Arab Israelis constitute for a quarter of Israeli citizens, therefore it's harmful. CG will give 3 reasons why this will work, claiming OG benefit while dealing with the urgency. One, current coalition, unlike popular belief or unlike what opposition tried to tell you, is not that strong. It is falling apart. People know that they're not the best in making their decisions. And this is not only talking about Arab Israelis, who generally are constantly fucked up by the coalition, but it is even talking about the majority of Jews, for example, living in the West Bank, where the coalition is seen to be inconsistent. For example, in recently providing extended protection to the citizens of the West Bank. People are questioning the quality of this coalition. Now they see it as weak. This is not the party that they voted back in 2021. What's the implication, right? This is to say that A, majority of people, even including Jews, are disappointed with the coalition, and B, majority of people are looking for a fresh air. This means that opportunity is actually pretty big. Understanding how, for example, a Slovenian green environmentalist party who were just made a year ago can actually win an election against a 4-time incumbent, right? This is how powerful rhetoric and narrative can actually be, and this can only be used exclusively if you actively oppose and criticize the majority party, showcasing where they're bad, not only to the Arab Israelis, for example, but also showcasing their failures, showcasing their weaknesses towards the majority of Jews who would happen to buy into your rhetoric as well, because they see and feel firsthand experience that the party is disappointing them to begin with. In opposition, it is exclusive in CG because in opposition you cannot do that. Why? Because your political standing, your political survivability to begin with is dependent on the coalition. If the coalition falls, you also fall in opposition. In our side of the house, if you actively oppose them, it means that if they fall, you rise to power. This is the exact ideal scenario that we want. In Gulf, in opposition, we will be constantly silent, nothing to say about the weaknesses of the current coalition. Before I move on to the second point, I'm going to take opening.
Sure. Why does your principle of fighting for justice is above our principle of simply not wanting to go into war and risking thousands of lives?
War would probably not happen in a domestic context. I don't really know why Bennett and Lapid would probably use military power whatsoever. No mechanization on why they're likely to do that. I think in our side of the house, even if that does happen, it's still a legitimate form of self-defense that has not been negated by any of opposition principle. Second point of likelihood, right? This is a really time-sensitive likelihood analysis, and this is to analyze that the right-wing party in status quo is still consolidating power, proven by them, for example, having to make coalition and to compromise so bad that 2 prime ministers have to share their position during a 4-year term. Therefore, this means that the right-wing power, even if they're not that bad or urgently as weak as what I mentioned in the first point, they're also still not that powerful just yet in status quo. They're going to be much more powerful in the future if you do support them in opposition. Therefore, if you choose to oppose them in the future, I don't really know what opposition is trying to do. No chance to succeed because they will be already powerful by then. They will probably not need your coalition anymore. They used you enough to consolidate their power. In our side of the house, understanding that they are still consolidating power is the perfect momentum that we have to opt in. So if in both sides of the house you will essentially oppose them, it's better to oppose them now in opposing government rather than oppose them in the future where they're already much more powerful than status quo. But last point of likelihood, right? You get massive support from international community who have their interest on your party against the Bennett and Lapid coalition. This is obviously talking about several important countries. We're talking about Palestine and countries supporting Palestine, for example, in the Middle East. They will hate Bennett to death and will do whatever in their power to have Arab-Israeli parties. They do have a stake here. Even the US, for example, will probably try to support your party because the leftist shift, right? And for example, how Biden was loudly criticized because he did not move the embassy of Israel back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem. My point here is that there are international shift supporting your ideology and against the particular coalition who are already even seen by the majority of Jews as bad. This argument is really important because it does not only give you an extra benefit, it fulfills the prerequisite and likelihood on why opening government benefit could exist. Their case cannot exist without the prerequisite of closing government. We're so proud to be.
Thank you for that speech. Now call upon member of opposition here.
Give me a sec. Set my timer. I'll take verbal POI, by the way. And I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We have to remember that Yair Lapid or Natalie Bennett, he has a huge prominent influence. If we're to oppose this whole progress that we've been doing this whole time, where Israel government want to have a coalition with Arab Israeli, we will lose every progress that we have made this whole time. And it is important for Arab Israeli, especially the Arab Israeli political party, because we want to progress, we want to be seen in this Israeli society, because there are a lot of has been a lot of violent extreme movement this whole time especially in the Israeli society. But knowing that we exist and we have been making this coalition with the government, there are a lot of better conditions, that are less racism towards Muslim, etc., etc., etc. And we're not going to actively oppose that, but we're still watching. We're still scrutinizing the Israeli government. But if there is anything that is opposing the Arab Israeli, we will still able to voice our opinion. But before we moving towards substantive, let me mention a thing as to what the government is trying to mention here. They mentioned all the concerns in regards to Lapid is centrist, but will not make a centrist policy because, he's still very much right. It's like Netanyahu. First response, no, Lapid is pretty much centrist. Number two, even if there is a huge genuine concerns in regards to policy being authoritarian, because Lapid is still having indication or symptoms of being far right, Lapid works under a former Lapid works as a former journalist in the Israel government. The possible authoritarian policy will not be revolving around social issues like human rights, especially for Muslim rights, etc., etc., etc. But he will most likely to revolve around, media or journalistic system policies, for example. So no, he will not be authoritarian. He will not be Netanyahu 2.0 or whatever. In the worst case, he will most likely to only going for to be someone who is strongly authoritarian within his media control and not the social and rights policy. And moving on towards my substantive, actively opposing this not only can harm Arab-Israeli position in the parliament, but also can harm the objective of Arab political parties within the Israel government. Number one, why is it able to harm the Arab-Israeli political parties' position? Arab-Israeli parties built upon the objective to scrutinize the Israeli government. We seek to any of the change within the Israeli government to either acknowledge the Muslim both in Israel and especially in Palestine freedom over Israeli tension this whole time, or simply by leaving the Palestinian Muslim alone. We have never have any concerns in regards to build a coalition with Bennett or any centrist party, especially with Bennett isn't necessarily extreme like Netanyahu. We think that Bennett was the best alternative for the supportivity he has towards our political objective under Israeli government. So Bennett was inherently better, primarily because he's not extreme and not like Netanyahu. What we're trying to say is that under Israeli government, regardless of where their position in their political ideologies are, so the more representative prominent towards center, the more supportive they are towards Arab Israeli political party. How? Number one, Netanyahu is more extreme and he's violent. Number two, on the other hand, the very reason we chose Bennett is not only that he's winning, but he's the only alternative that we have. Regardless of how egotistical he is and the policy issues that he's been making this whole time, but notice that he's able to make a coalition along with the other political parties in the first place. So we say that the alternative, which is Bennett, is inherently better. And if there is anything being the alternative of Bennett, would be a lot better as well. Knowing that Lapid is more centrist than Bennett. If we were to decide to not oppose Lapid, knowing that his position is more centrist, it's contradicting what we have been doing this whole time to seek alternative within the post-Palestinian war government. He has no indication to be an extremist, so he won't make an extreme violent policy. What does it do for us? Number one, opposing Lapid, meaning that we are opposing any policies to seek policy making, policy that orients towards right of Muslims both in Israel and Palestine. Is the other alternatives, and he's inherently better, like the frame that we explained to you previously, mainly because he's not only a centrist, and he's likely to be only authoritarian towards media and not social policy, etc., etc. So if anything, if he ends up being authoritarians, Muslims and Arabs in Israel and in Palestine especially won't be affected. But on contrary, if we oppose the coalition with Lapid's and the centrist party, there will less likely chance to make more policy for Arab and Muslim citizens in Israel and especially in Palestine. Knowing that, we've always been trying to scrutinize as a check and balance towards the huge chance of Israelis extremism. If we oppose the coalition, the concerns that government bench concerned about might actually be true. How? Number one, we already seen it happen under the Bennett governments. He still managed to be uncooperative and he still managed to be authoritarian towards Palestinian. But we managed to not make it too far because we have the coalition with Bennett and the centrist party to scrutinize and check and balance his activity under his governments, not under his government. That's to say, no check and balance, and opposing this meaning that Lapid won't be having any check and balance. His authoritarian tendencies, like what opening government bench has been, concerned about, might actually be true. And knowing that he likely to be authoritarian towards media policy is not only going to hurt the journalists, but also the Jews, the Muslims, because there's a huge epidemic of authoritarian journalistic policy. There will be a huge epidemic of propaganda or whatever. That's what will likely to happen if we're to oppose the Lapid governments. Under our side, comparatively, we will still have the ability to scrutinize the Israeli government because we are not opposing them, and we will still have the check and balance. And the government will not turn into authoritarian maniac. And if we're not opposing the Lapid's position here, there will still be check and balance, and Lapid won't be having any chance to be authoritarian or whatever, and therefore it's inherently better for us to just not opposing any of the coalition that is happening, especially under Lapid's governments, and that is what we are very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. To wrap up government's case, I call upon government whip here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. If anyone wants to POI, please do so through the chat. All right, I'm gonna begin in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to be doing three things in this debate. In this piece, firstly, I'm going to talk about CO, and then I'm going to talk about O and why. Lastly, I'm going to give you a summary as to why we still win over opening government. First, let's talk about CO, right? Basically, the entire CO case is one point. We want more second balance because we want to criticize Lapid and we want to also criticize Bennett right now, for example. So in that particular sense, we can actually win over the cabinet, and then we can still like push for our policy list and then right. I don't think that this is effective, right? Because in some sense, they also want to support the government that exists right now. They also want to support the coalition, but they also want to scrutinize. I think that scrutiny can actually be established more when we actually oppose them and give them more reason to actually listen to us rather than just supporting them but kind of criticizing them. So in that particular sense, I think that CO is already out. So let's talk about OO then and why we think that opposition as a whole, we cannot actually gain more centrist policy if we go by the route of actually supporting the current coalition right now, and why it's better to actually just completely oppose them, right? So I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the centrist view, which is the entire case of the opening opposition and in some part the closing opposition. Secondly, I'm going to tell you the likelihood as to why we can still win as the Arab-Israeli party. And thirdly, I'm going to tell you why most likely, even if we don't win, the risk is probably not that high, and most likely it's a principal justification for us to do so. So first, let's talk about the centrist view, right? The entire opposition case relies on the fact or the assumption that Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett is actually a centrist individual and will not actually go for far-right policy. We do not believe that this is the case at all. Just the fact that you are labeled as a centrist doesn't mean that you're necessarily a centrist or that your policy in the future will be centrist policies and you're going to help the Arab-Israeli party. Why is this the case, ladies and gentlemen? Simply, right? The context in this debate is that the reason as to why Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett has this coalition to begin with is because of the chaos of the previous election, ladies and gentlemen, right? The reason as to why they're making a coalition is because at the very least, they want for the Israeli government to run. Because in the absence of a leader after Netanyahu, they needed something to actually hold up the coalition together. So that's why they're making this coalition in the first place, for example, it's Enderman. And that's also why in the past years, the Israeli government has been more centrist. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the overarching view and the overarching interest of the party suddenly shifted to be centrist. This entire particular play here is for the government to actually run. What's going to happen in the future when the government is actually running is that most likely the far-right policy is going to return to Israel, for example, and there's going to be more oppression, right? This is the missing context that proves to you why most likely the far-right policy is going to be absent momentarily, but not necessarily absent forever. So in that particular sense, why do we need to oppose them now? This is moving on to the second point. Why do we think that it's likely in this particular context that we win, right? Justin brought in an important point that was missing in OG, right? The fact is right now, because there is still a consolidation of power, which means that the parties right now in the coalition is bickering over one another because there is not one party that's like ruling over all, meaning that most likely there is a high golden opportunity for us to actually gain power, right? Justin told you about how not only Arab Israelis are actually seeing this as an opportunity, but also Israelis, for example, especially those who are living in the West Bank, already see the coalition as inconsistent because there are so many parties in the coalition that's bickering over one another over the matter of policy, that the policy that they create is actually going to be inconsistent, especially in the West Bank, for example, it's ended, right? So meaning that the coalition right now is not only weak in power because Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid is still consolidating power, but also the policy that they're creating as a practical government is also being called into question. This means, ladies and gentlemen, that most likely when we actually go in right now, this is a golden opportunity to actually gain power, right? We're going to be seen as a party that actually has a clear goal, for example, and we're going to be seen as a party that can actually, take this opportunity to actually gain more seats in the cabinet to begin with, ladies and gentlemen, right? This is why most likely it's going to be time sensitive. The comparison in opening opposition and closing opposition is simple. When you're going to only scrutinize in CO, or when you're going to only support in OO, most likely you're not going to gain any of the chances at all. Because number one, they never really told you why this is likely to happen to begin with. Because notice that you're only going to support them, so you're going to support the far-right policy in the future. But secondly, exactly because as I told you before, the context in this debate is the consolidation of power. Most likely when they have actually consolidated power in the in the future, for example, the gateway for you to actually create better policies for the Arab Israelis and for the Palestinians is going to be closed off, because when the far right is actually going to grow in the power because under the leadership of Yair Lapid or whoever goes on in 2026, for example, most likely you're going to lose this opportunity because you have less bargaining power in the cabinet right now. So in that particular sense, you're going to lose on political power that exists right now, and that's why it's urgent for us to actually support the coalition, to oppose the coalition, I mean, right now, and to actually gain some power in this particular time frame, right? Most likely they're not going to gain any power for like another decades, for example. So that's why we need to do it right now. But so that's our exclusive contribution from CZ there. But lastly, right, why do we think that even if the coalition fails, or like our gambit fails, and the coalition still exists, and we do not gain power, why is it still justifiable, right? Firstly, we do not think that the risk is as big as OO has tried to tell you. OO has been trying to tell you that, hey, if you oppose the coalition party, we're literally going to go to war. This is very, very unrealistic, listen them, right? As I told you before, the reason as to why the coalition exists is because there is a concentration of power, and they want the government to run. In this particular time frame of political instability, the last thing that Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid wants is fucking war, listen them, right? When you actually wage a domestic war, most likely you're going to go up against the Arab Israelis, and in that particular sense, the country is literally going to be a hellhole where you're going to be seen as fighting in every single street, for example. Noting also that Arab Israelis literally consists of some part of the population which is quite big, ladies and gentlemen, right? So that's not going to happen, right? Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, Justin already told you an important principle point about how this is tried. OO has been trying to tell you about how this is bad because we're going to get killed, we're going to lose. That doesn't matter, because most likely as an Arab Israeli, for example, your only interest to actually gain rights for your people and your family. So in that particular sense, most likely you're going to go the principle route, and most likely you're going to fight no matter what, even if you fail or succeed. And ladies and gentlemen, notice that this is also, as I said before, an active debate, right? This is not going to be talking about rational, ladies and gentlemen. Most likely Arab Israelis in the status quo is already sick and tired of the oppression that they are being given by the Israeli government. They are sick and tired of the fact that their homes are literally being torn down by the Israeli government, and that's why most likely they're wanting to fight. In that particular sense, ladies and gentlemen, I do not think that you as an Arab Israeli will just want to support the coalition party that is constantly oppressing you, rather than trying to fight, even though you might not succeed, to be at the very least you're actually trying to fight your oppressors. So in that particular three reasons, I do not believe that the justification argument of not succeeding under opening opposition can actually fly. So on that's all towards the opposition bands, and that's why we went over them. Why we went over OZ then? We went over OZ because even though OZ supplies a lot of harm about supporting Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, they never told you the likelihood, and they were quite pessimistic about how you're going to win, right? We told you the likelihood as to why we're going to win. We told you about how the consolidation of power means a golden opportunity. We told you about the rising of international support. For example, we already told you about how Israel started already questioning the coalition, for example, meaning that those likelihood or this justifies our policy and why our policy is going to work. Because of that, we are very proud to propose. Thank you very much.
To conclude the debate, I call upon opposition whip, and I thank the government whip for their speech. Here.
Let me put my timer first. UI through chat. Okay, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. We think that what happened in this debate, that there's like two major classes that is happening in this debate, like whether or not the coalition is actually justifiable, or secondly, whether a coalition would give more harm or give more good for the Arab Israeli, right? So first, we're going to move to the first class, right? First, OG trying to say that it's not justified because basically Arab Israeli being used by the coalition, it's basically being their position is being used by this political power, right? So we said that even like those factually correct, we say that it is okay, right? Firstly, we said that the condition of the Arab Israeli is not really good because they live in Israel, they live in Israel, so that means that the condition is not going to be as good as you would think, right? So this thing that we think that this is we think that this is actually much better because we don't want that the interest of Arab Israeli to having, and we don't think that the interest of Arab Israeli is having much more power, right? We think that we have to separate the Arab Israeli party and the regular people, because we think, yes, the Arab Israeli party wants more power because of like history, etc. But we think that the interest of the Arab Israeli living in Israel is to have like a basic, safeful and peaceful life, right? So thirdly, we think that the most important for Arab Israeli is now much more on a peaceful life and an economic benefit, right? This thing is only happening if you don't. We think that we don't. This thing is only happening if you don't actively oppose it, right? Because when you don't oppose it, we think that the central government, the Israeli government, wouldn't do something that we don't do something horrible, right? When you actively oppose or something like that, we think that the opposition, the government side of the house, the government of the Israel would be much more extreme, have a much more extreme view towards you, and this is something that we don't think want for the Arab Israeli, right? Because for Arab Israeli, we don't think for their daily life that it's not really strong. For now, we don't think that much more much more like extra 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 like burden for them. They don't want that, right? Because we think that safety is something that is important for the Arab Israeli, right? So we see how in Kurdistansco, how like I forgot what the what the event is, that like what the Jewish extremists do to the Arab Israeli, right? When they said, when like in like the Independence Day of Israel, right? This is example for you that the Arab Israeli condition is not that good. So that means that for Arab Israeli, this is much more okay, that much more suitable for them, rather than being opposed to the central government that is already kind of like against them. We think that much more like supporting the coalition. At least the daily condition is going to be much more better for themselves, right? So we think that we think at least you don't get attacked because you don't get attacked because you're against the government, and we think that when you at least your position wouldn't be worsening, right? Because because they want to have like at least a stable life and the economic condition, and we think that political stability is something that's important for the Arab Israeli, right? Coming to my second classes, right? Whether is the coalition going to give more harm or good to the Arab Israeli, right? So when the government side of the house say that making like third coalition consists of the Arab Israeli party, and it's much better, even if like its fail is okay. We don't think that the third coalition would be better for the Arab, would be better, right? Because the Arab Israeli party is not that powerful, that even if like you make a voting bloc, etc., right? This also means that when you make those like third coalition, or you broken up with the current coalition, this means also that you now against the majority party. We don't think this is going to be we don't think this is something that is actually strategic for this Arab Israeli party to do, right? Because now with this is going to be much more justifiable for the majority party to left them out, being having no power in the House of Representatives, because the benefit that you get when you do the coalition, at least you would get the House of Representatives. That means that your voices would be much more heard, right? So I think that's something that is important, right? Because this is the interest that the Arab Israeli want to have, right? Secondly, we think that when you don't oppose the program, the diplomatic, all of the like progressive file is still progressing, right? We think that the more progressive, I think, can actually much more happen when you don't actively oppose, because you don't have much more like the government wouldn't like actively push you to do something, right? So we think that is something that is important, right? So what exclusive points that we think come from the closing opposition, right? We think that the Arab Israeli daily life would be worse, right? We see that even if like the Bennett and the coalition that already happened is not really cooperative, we still manage to be like more more like progressing towards the Arab Israeli, right? So we think that this is, rather than make it too far, because making like we against the coalition, we think that rather than having like much more supporting the coalition, we think that at least this life would be their life would be at least better, right? That is to say, we said the check and balance at least could be much better, right? Because exactly because of that, we don't think that the government would be have any wouldn't have any like justification to have like much more extreme way to for them, because they don't do something that is too actively opposed, because now that so now that means that the government at least they didn't see you as like didn't see you as like against the government. So we think that this is something that is important, right? Because what is the most important, and what is the most important for the Arab Israeli itself is their like peace, is their daily life, something that they need to do, something that they need to have when they live in a country where in their daily life their safety is kind of like questionable, right? That's why we think that the most important thing in this debate to prove, proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for the debate. I think the judges can go to spare room K3 to deliberate. Feel free to stay or to leave the breakout room. Thank you.